Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Nicole Donelson, Vice President of Philanthropic Strategies and Partnerships at the Central Florida Foundation, and I'm joined today by Mark Brewer, President and CEO of the Central Florida Foundation. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about the transfer of wealth, share some interesting data that we've received to update you, just a little bit of housekeeping for those who are attending live. We want this to be a conversation, so feel free at any point in time to plug in some questions in the Q&A or in the chat. We're happy to address some of those questions as we move throughout this discussion. We also are going to be tagging back and forth, and in between those, we'll put out and ask for any questions that there may be to clarify. So for now, I'm going to hand it over to Mark Brewer.
Thanks, Nicole, and good afternoon, everyone. The Central Florida Foundation is the region's community foundation. And so our primary role is to build philanthropy by building the community, or building community by building philanthropy. So you may not have thought about this much, but great communities are really made up of people who are engaged and invested in those communities. And our role is to bring strategic philanthropy forward. Now, what does that mean? I think you're all familiar with philanthropy from the traditional retail side. That's where thousands of nonprofits, almost 17,000 in our region, are focused on asking people for money to do the work they do in healthcare, education, arts and culture, human services, and including environment, and then in addition to that, all the faith-based community organizations that are here. So when they come forward and ask people for money and they give it, that's thought of as retail philanthropy. That's the ability to do fundraising, either through direct asks or through some level of structure, which is usually an event of some sort or an annual campaign of some sort. The Central Florida Foundation's role since 1994 has been to be the entity that really launches strategic philanthropy in the community, the ability for individuals, families, and nonprofits to bind together to build philanthropic capital for bigger, more complex things in the community. And so because all of the demands and the needs of the community are ever growing, if you think of the marketplace, you would think of the foundation as being the investor, while you would think of retail philanthropy as the common revenue source for things that happen. So the foundation, established in 1994 by a handful of people in the community, by which were some senior members of the Winterweedle group, who came together to say, we need a community foundation in the region that can help us build this more strategic investment strategy. Otherwise, we will be only a retail entity. And so as those folks came together, mayors, bank presidents, legal partners, and lots of other professional advisors, they built the Central Florida Foundation to be that place where we can transform our region for more good. Next slide. So one of the things that you'll recognize if you know the Central Florida Foundation is that our role is in almost everything that goes on in the community. Literally, we are a three-sector thread, which means the private sector, the public sector, and the independent sector all come together around things like homelessness, housing, hunger, the bigger issues of how we create more quality of life in the community. And the Central Florida Foundation's role is to help kind of build that collaboration, bring ideas we may generate or others may generate, but to create the place where those ideas can actually sprout, and then bring investment. Now, in some cases, it's grants from the foundation. In some cases, it's capital we bring from other places and other investors. But at the end of the day, the independent sector, the third sector, the nonprofit sector, whatever you want to call it, its primary job is innovation and creativity. Its job is to do the things the other two sectors, the private sector and the public sector, either can't do or won't do. And unlike the other two sectors in the economy, those sectors don't even start without capital. The independent sector's job is to be innovative and creative, and that attracts capital. So the Central Florida Foundation has a long history of piloting big picture systemic solution strategies that draw capital and have created solutions to larger area things around housing, homelessness, feeding of hungry people, working in the quality of life areas that we're in. And then last, high impact philanthropy also includes legacy. So if you think in terms of all the people who might pass away and leave behind some kind of resource for the future, the Central Florida Foundation's primary job is to make sure that that donor intent stays in place and doesn't move. It goes the direction that it's supposed to do based on the will and the intent of the people who left it. Next slide. So that brings us to an issue now where the Central Florida Foundation has been involved for more than 20 years. About every 10 years, we fund a new or updated transfer of wealth study. Now, the newest study is actually created for the entire state of Florida, but including Central Florida, and it involves other funders, not just us, but other foundations around the state. But we come together to fund this study because it's an indication of what the real, actual ability of communities are to fund the things that they care about. I think you've all been in meetings from one time or another where people say, oh, we have this big problem and we don't have any money. Well, the reality is our community has lots of money, but you have to look at it in a different way, other than the more traditional retail philanthropic way. And I'm going to hand it back to Nicole to lead you through this process.
Thanks, Mark. So the transfer of wealth, when we talk about it, is the actual transfer from one generation to the next. But when we think about that, the primary transfer that we're looking at, there's going to be a significant transfer down to Gen X and millennials. When the initial report was done nationwide, it was looking at over a period of about 30 years. But as Mark mentioned, assessing how that's changing over a period of 10 years and so much influences that. Advisors are going to play a really critical role in terms of playing a part in this transfer. And there's multiple components to consider along the way in this discussion. I think a lot of times we hear, oh, you know, Central Florida, Orlando, we're a young growing community. We don't have nearly the size of wealth as other parts of the state of Florida. But that's just not true. And I think some of the data is going to be able to show supporting that we have a very large undeveloped community assets here that is important for us to capture for the purpose of the furthering the community. Next slide. So back in April of 2018, there was a feature of this huge windfall years that are coming over, again, this period of 30 years of $9 trillion and counting for the nation. And we wanted to gain a better understanding of what that looked like for the state of Florida, as well as for the Central Florida region. Obviously, there's a lot of changes that have happened over time. You think about just even in the last 2 or 3 years alone, the pandemic, which increased, moving of individuals coming in from other states. We saw a large influx from California, from New York, and I think Orlando has already been, and Central Florida as a whole, has been a community that sees a significant number of people moving in, 1,500 people a week that are moving here. And while a lot of that, the focus of philanthropy, where they're choosing to give back, is oftentimes still connected to where they lived before, we find more and more that as they place down roots in their new community, they're interested in putting those dollars and investing them where they are placed today. one thing to note too is that this isn't a transfer that we're going to see happen again for decades to come. And so the timing is critical as far as the conversation taking place right now. Next slide. So I'm going to let Mark talk a little bit about specifically what does that wealth look like here in our region.
Thanks, Nicole. So let's dig into the data a little bit here. You start in a transfer of wealth survey by figuring out what the current wealth is, and then what we expect the wealth to grow to, and then what that transfer to the next generations will look like. So I want to be clear that when we talk about transfer of wealth, we're not talking about only wealthy people. If you were a school teacher who earned $50,000 a year, you might not actually be able to give much during your lifetime. But at the end of your life, you might have a home and a checking account and other assets that you would then shift to younger generations. And so when we look at this, we're looking at debt, homes, bank accounts, retirement accounts, closely held family businesses. Now, one thing we're not including in the data for this study are things like trusts or other hard to value assets. All of you work with clients who have illiquid assets, or they have other depreciating assets that are more complicated to try to gauge because we're using tax data and direct data here. But here's the important thing. Our region's wealth right now is about $1.2 trillion. And across Florida, that's almost $7.5 trillion. That's a lot of money. And that money is in the pockets of people from low income to high income. And that wealth is where we start the track of transfer of wealth, because whatever wealth you have now will have to go somewhere when you're gone. You may spend it all while you're alive, but if you don't, then it has to go somewhere when you're gone. Next slide. So I want to give you some gritty detail here around giving trends, just so you kind of get a sense for where this money might go. There are about 18,500 nonprofits in the region, and they have a revenue of about $23 billion. Now, that in a minute is a surprise to most people because they think of the nonprofit sector as being mostly volunteer organizations who are probably doing good work, but they're not really part of the economy. The reality is the nonprofit sector is the third largest employer in the sector, just behind tourism, but ahead of construction and retail. And the nonprofit sector provides quality of life. Now, for this particular data set, Central Florida includes Hardy, Highlands, Lake, Marion, Orange, Osceola, Polk, Seminole, and Sumter counties. And the reason it includes that is because that's the plat on which data is collected nationally. Most of you know that we consider Central Florida, Orange, Osceola, Seminole, Lake, Brevard, Polk, and Volusia. And so there are a couple of counties in our kind of makeshift Central Florida region that aren't here, but this is the way the federal government and the rest of the world looks at the economy in Central Florida. So the giving trends are kind of interesting in Central Florida. Almost 70% give to charitable organizations. Almost 87% give informally. What that means is they give when they're asked. More than a quarter give to racial justice causes, and more than half of the people in the region volunteer. That's an important number because if you go back 5 years, it didn't look that way. 5 and 10 years ago, in fact, the last time we did a transfer of wealth study, the volunteerism in the region was less than 40%. So as we mature as a community, we tend to be more engaged than we have in the past. Now, because we're sitting in Orange County, I just want to give you a quick snapshot of Orange County. About 73% give to charitable organizations, more than 85% give informally when they're asked. They give to racial justice causes at just more than a third of the community, and just about 60% of the community volunteers in one way or the other. The Central Florida region makes up about 19% of all the giving in the state, And if you're wondering what that number looks like, it's a little north of $5 billion a year. So the average gift is about $2,000 a year, putting the region 5th out of 8th of all the regions in the state. So we aren't the biggest givers, but we're givers. Down to the bottom right of this slide, you can see county numbers, which I won't go into now, but just understand that from a regional standpoint, we are a healthy region, both locally, statewide, and nationally. We're not in the top 10%, but we're also not in the bottom 10%, and that's an important thing. Next slide. So this transfer that's happening now over 10 years is about $150 billion in the region, or close to $884 billion statewide. If you look further out over 50 years, based on the progressive data, it's $2 trillion, or about $11.3 trillion statewide. So when people say, oh, we don't have any money here, the reality is we do. The problem is we typically only look at philanthropy as a retail instrument and not as something of value. Next slide. So if you look at the numbers individually by county, I just want to point out to you, because you're all professional advisors who work with clients and may work with clients in all these counties, that the 2020 net worth, the 10-year transfer, and the per household number is pretty significant. I also want to point out to you that the per household number doesn't represent high net worth people. So in Orange County, the per household transfer is about $58,000. Again, back to my analysis of a school teacher who might have earned $50,000 a year, owned a house and a checking account, and through her life might not have been a big charitable giver, but at her death, she can make a significant difference. And then I want you to look on to the 50-year transfer of per household being $1.1 million. Now, look, you're all lawyers, so transfer of wealth equals inflation. Understand that the part of this calculation is the assumption of how assets will grow. I also want you to note that Orange County is the biggest in the region. Many people would think that would be Seminole County because of its wealth numbers, but it's not. And Brevard County is a quick second to this, as is also the case in economic development. So if you look at Brevard, Volusia, those two counties on the coast are growing in economic development faster than the counties in the middle of the state. And so while Orange County is well ahead, and by surprise to some, ahead of Seminole County, it is in the shadow of Brevard and Volusia, who could easily catch up to this in the next 10 years. Next slide. So why does all this matter? Everyone has read the numbers nationally. They know people are transferring wealth. What people aren't thinking about is that wealth is passing by the window outside your office while we're talking. So the question would be, what if community members were to leave just 5% of this transfer of wealth as grants at the end of their life? Now, you all know that that would give them some tax advantage and might also help them transfer more wealth or more easily transfer wealth. But that would be, just out of our transfer of wealth, a potential of $751 million in grants that could be produced and given directly to the sector, given to the entities, any of those 18,000 that people in Central Florida care about, or across the board to many of them in order to solve complex social problems. Next slide. Here's the more important question for you to consider. What if the 5% of this transfer of wealth were endowed to sustainably address future community needs, whatever the donor intent might be? Endowments of $7.5 billion, which would be 5% of all that transfer of wealth, could support grant making of $8.6 billion over 20 years. That's substantial. So imagine the difference between a today gift and a forever gift. And imagine the difference between 5%, a relatively small percentage of a transfer of wealth, and the tax advantage that might bring, And what you see is that all of us as citizens of Central Florida have the ability to make a forever legacy investment in the community. Next slide. Now, I do want to point out that impact investment is a big thing in Central Florida. And if you're not familiar with that, it basically means your ability to make an investment in something that has both a return and a social impact. So an impact investment is the ability for us to make an investment in a social enterprise or in something in the community that has a return of investment to us, but also has measurable social outcomes. So one question in this transfer of wealth is, what if 5 cents of all of these endowed dollars were invested locally? At the Central Florida Foundation, we make investments out of our corpus, which is the money that we have invested from all of our philanthropists, in local issues like housing, social enterprise, and those things primarily create a return, but they also include a social good. So we have kind of two guns to fire in the same battle. We have grants that we can give, and we have investments from our corpus. So if just 5% of all this money from the transfer of wealth were invested locally, we could probably, from these endowments, leverage $5.5 billion for community needs that your clients may care about. At the end of the day, this is about leverage, and it's about thinking about investment in a way that most people don't. They think about how much money they have in their pocket, or they think about what they've got in their wallet, but they may not think about what they have available in their lifetime to make this happen. Next slide. So I want to hand it back to Nicole to talk a little bit about what this transfer of wealth gifting might look like.
Thanks, Mark. So I know, the message has been touched on as far as everybody has wealth. And I think the concept of being a part of greater collective giving, greater collective impact is important to a lot of people. I think when we talk about how everyone has some kind of wealth, and obviously there are those that are high net worth, ultra high net worth, who have capacity to give at a much greater percentage, and maybe they have certain tax or estate needs in order to give a much greater amount at the time of death or even in life. But knowing that even 5% can lead to very purposeful charitable giving. We hear it from people all the time and from other advisors that clients want to give. Oftentimes they're not sure where to. What we would like to challenge advisors to be thinking about is having those discussions now with your clients if you're not already. And they want you to ask, so if you have a client that is charitably inclined, being able to start that conversation. And if that's a space that you're not as comfortable in, that's obviously something that the Central Florida Foundation is happy to provide you some guidance around. In addition, the foundation has a great resource available for you or for your clients to start the journey of kind of identifying places to give back through nonprofit search. It's a searchable platform that has hundreds of nonprofits in the Central Florida community, providing a very transparent view into the finances, governance, impact needs in order to better identify the organizations that they would like to engage further and deeper with. Mark mentioned endowment, and I think, again, just thinking about these last few years and even just recently with the impact of Hurricane Ian, we don't know what sort of unknowns might occur for our community, and having a sustainable source to support nonprofits and ever-changing needs of the community is critical. The ability to have an endowment, which is a permanent placement of these dollars that can be invested, again, maybe a part of that is invested locally back into the community to support things like a social enterprise, but also being able to just create that sustainability long-term. The Central Florida Foundation does work with families to help create endowments. We work with nonprofits to assist them in establishing endowments as well. So I think one of the things that stands out the most is timing of conversation. This is an opportunity to be able to advance your client relationships if you're thinking about next generation engagement. If you want to sustain that long-term relationship where you have family members that are going to be passing the baton and want to continue that relationship, philanthropy is a great talking point to be able to put everyone on the same page and be able to engage that next generation, small baby steps, and starts with simple questions about looking for what are the things that they're most interested in, what are the things that they've gotten the most joy out of participating in the past, or maybe even what are some of their fears, what are some of the places that things have gone wrong, that are kind of steering how they feel about their giving. Mark, you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's good, Nicole. The reality is that giving is kind of broken up into forever or short term. And so some families will want to spend down whatever they send out as their legacy. Some will want to endow it forever. And whichever path you choose is still a way to support the community in a measurable way for which your legacy can be connected. So as you talk to families about the future, the question is, what role do they want to play and how do they want assets put together in order to make that happen?
Great. I think that's great, Mark. I don't know if there are any questions from those who are attending, but feel free if you have any to put them in the chat or the Q&A. Mark, what do you feel like might be one way that advisors can kind of begin to bring this transfer of wealth discussion front of mind with their clients as they begin to have conversations and kind of look at that potential impact?
Yeah, so, one of the things that strikes me is that about 70% of second and third generation children will not retain advisors their parents had, primarily because they haven't had any conversations with them. So at some level, as you begin to think through what the transfer of wealth structure looks like, engaging children to think through what they care about and what role they might want to play is an important part of this continuum. And in talking to advisors around the country who have had success with this, it's usually a conversation that starts with, what do you care about? Now, look, in the old days, you could go back 10, 20, 30 years, there was a matriarch and a patriarch in a family, and they determined what would happen with philanthropy for the next generations and told the children. Today, it's more likely that the next generation of children will be able to tell you what's important, and having their advisor in the circle for that conversation is kind of a critical point. And I would just throw in, Nicole, that all of us at the Central Florida Foundation work with advisors every day in helping them help solve whatever issues their clients and their children might have. So you can call on us at any time if your clients and their children are having conversations and you want to know what are the best practices, what are other people doing, what works well or doesn't work well. That's something we can certainly help with.
I think one question that I've heard quite a bit from some advisors is, where do I start? Where do I start this conversation? What should I be asking? Just feeling some discomfort in some of this conversation and kind of where to take it. From Mark, from your perspective, what do you think might be some things that you would share for advisors who say that?
Yeah, so the first will be counterintuitive. It's stay away from discussions around structure and technicalities. In other words, having the conversation with a family about what they care about, what their history is, what they've given to in the past is not the same thing as talking to them about a trust or a private foundation or working through other structures like the Central Florida Foundation to make those things happen. So stay away from the technical side of it and try to ask the question, what else matters to you and your family in life? It's also a relatively interesting thing, and many advisors, especially legal advisors, know this intuitively, but how do your clients feel about money? So you understand that some of your clients think of money as a security piece in which they want to protect it as long as they can, and some of them literally want to control it after they're gone. Others think of money as a tool for which they can do things or make things happen. So understanding how your clients feel about money is a great kind of first step to asking the question, what else do you care about? You clearly care about your spouse and your children and other family members. You clearly care about other things that you've identified in your final documents, whether they're wills or trusts. What else do you care about? What in the community matters to you? The community where you earned your wealth. What is it? What matters to you beyond that? That's a great kind of starting point for the conversation.
Yeah, I would agree. I think also having an understanding of where your client is coming from their experience in giving. I think we see a lot of people who hit a point in time where they've been giving and giving to one particular effort cause, and they aren't really sure if they've made an impact, and they start to really look at, how am I making things different? And so thinking about the world as far as affecting systems change, can I continue to feed hungry people, or can I try and look to figure out how to solve hunger? Two very different things. And not everybody gets to that point in time, but I think there are critical points along the way. And some of that may even be at a point in time where they're thinking about their estate and they're sitting down with their estate attorney and talking about, what happens when I die, and starting to have that reality of really starting to contemplate what have I done with my life, or having been through the pandemic and just facing some very, large challenges, and starting to think, in all this time, what have I been able to accomplish, or what do I want to do in leaving my mark? I would also challenge for those who are working on the estate side, where the conversation is maybe primarily focusing on what the plans are at the time of death, that you have clients sitting in front of you who are likely wanting to do more now in life, or to be able to start some of that legacy building in life, and being able to have some of those conversations and be a part of that, so that you can continue to shift and shape those conversations down the road. These are not single point in time conversations. And just as we do these wealth studies over a period of 10 years, a lot can change in that 10-year period of time. And so this is a perfect opportunity for you to use this as an excuse, a reason to be in front of your clients and having, updated conversations, and stay tuned into what's happening in their life.
That's a great kind of description of the continuum of giving. Everyone starts on the retail side where they give when they're asked, and then eventually they move to there's some things they really care about, and then they move on and recognize at some point in time, I'm giving to a lot of things. Could I give more to fewer things and make a difference? I love to tell the story about a couple that I met a few years ago who came to us, and they were trying to create a philanthropy plan and wanted help from the foundation. And as we were meeting, I said to them, well, how much are you giving now? And the man looked at his wife and he said, gosh, I don't really know. And she said, well, hold on a minute. And she walked out of the conference room and made a phone call to their CPA, and came back a few minutes later. And she said, well, we gave almost $30,000 last year to almost 50 charities. And he said, okay. He said, so how does that fit into making a plan? And I said to him, if you knew you were going to spend $300,000 in philanthropy over the next 10 years, and that was your plan, would you do it differently than waiting for people to ask you? And he said, yes, I would. And so that's the aha moment that most people come to. And unfortunately, sometimes they don't come to it until they're close to death, when they have to finalize documents and make plans. And for us, that's always sad, because early in life is a better time to make your plan, so that you're not waiting until the last minute to determine what difference you can make. Because you can make a difference in life, you can make a difference in death, and you can make a difference with a foot on each side. And that's the point I think Nicole was trying to make.
Yeah. I think I've seen also the tug and pull sometimes, where families want to do and give more than just what they need for their deduction. And so giving is often above and beyond what the tax implications may mean. We talked earlier about some of that informal giving, which includes, you have a friend that's going through a hard time and assisting them by giving to their GoFundMe or whatever it may be. Even some of those in-kind donations that may come, those are seen as just as important forms of giving. And I think seeing the percentages as far as how many people assist in that way is understanding that from your client's perspective, how they view giving is not just how the IRS defines it. And so that's going to be a part of something they're considering too, as far as how they want to impact now and in the future.
And that's an area where we can help you at no charge. I mean, that's our role, is to build community by building philanthropy. But Nicole's point is really important. The thought process that the final gift is a transaction is not usually true. There are very few people who get to the end of their lives and decide that there's only 1, 2, or 3 organizations they want to give all their money to. They may want a continuing opportunity for their children and grandchildren to be involved, or they may just want the ability to have a portfolio of giving that isn't easily described as you would typically do it in a trust document or other document. So at the end of the day, the ability to think of especially everyone younger than a baby boomer, right? Baby boomers will probably be the last generation that are still somewhat transactional, but Gen X, the millennials, certainly Gen Z, and on to the alpha generation, these folks are all thinking well beyond their time here in how they place their philanthropy and what they wanted to accomplish.
I think that's a really good point. Mark, do you have any closing thoughts?
I don't, Nicole. If no one has questions, I think we've covered the basics.
Okay, then it looks like we're going to gift everyone on this call with some time back within the hour to finish. Appreciate you attending, and we look forward to engaging you further in conversation. Thank you so much.